Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt eyes watching you from between the pages of old books? This thought haunted me as I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the Riverside University Library. The musty scent of aged paper and leather bindings enveloped me like a familiar embrace, yet something felt distinctly wrong. The towering shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their shadows dancing in the amber light of antique reading lamps. Students huddled over textbooks in scattered silence, but an unspoken tension filled the air, as if the very walls harbored secrets too dark to speak aloud. I had transferred here after a devastating breakup that left my world in shambles. The quiet sanctuary of the library seemed like the perfect refuge to lose myself in studies and forget the pain that gnawed at my chest. But as I settled into a secluded corner table near the rare book section, an icy chill crawled down my spine. The sensation of being observed was unmistakable. Margaret, the head librarian, approached with measured steps. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as she studied me with curious eyes. "New here?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of years spent among these shelves. "Yes," I replied, pulling out my art history textbook. "Just transferred this semester." She nodded knowingly, but something flickered across her expression, a shadow of concern that made my stomach tight. "Well, welcome, just be careful in the late hours. This old building has its quirks." As Margaret retreated to her desk, I tried to focus on my reading, but concentration proved impossible. A faint whisper seemed to drift from the stacks behind me, so soft it might have been my imagination. I turned, scanning the narrow aisles between towering bookshelves, but saw only dust motes dancing in shafts of dying sunlight. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." My heart hammered against my ribs. I glanced around at the other students, but they remained absorbed in their work, oblivious to the desperate plea that echoed through the air. The voice was young, female, and filled with such anguish that it made my throat constrict. "Excuse me," I called to Margaret, my voice trembling slightly. "Did you hear that? Someone calling for help." Margaret's face went pale. She approached slowly, glancing nervously toward the rare book section. "What exactly did you hear?" "A voice, a woman asking for help." I watched her expression carefully, noting how her hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses. "You're not the first," she whispered, leaning closer. "This library, it has a history. A student disappeared here 3 years ago. Rebecca Morgan. Some say her spirit never left." The name hit me like a physical blow. Disappeared? What happened to her? Margaret's eyes darted around, ensuring no one else was listening. "She was an art student, brilliant but troubled. She spent countless hours here, working on her senior thesis about Gothic architecture. Then one night, she simply vanished. Security found her art supplies scattered in the basement archives, but no trace of Rebecca herself. Was she alone that night? That's the question, isn't it?" Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Professor David Stone was the last person to see her. He claimed she seemed distressed, said she was working late on research. but something never sat right with me about his story. As Margaret spoke, the temperature around us seemed to plummet. My breath came out in small puffs, and the lights flickered ominously. Other students began to notice, murmuring among themselves as they gathered their belongings and hastily left. "Where can I find Professor Stone?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. "Psychology department, 3rd floor of Hartwell Hall. But be careful," Margaret warned. "Some doors are better left unopened." That evening, I couldn't shake the image of Rebecca from my mind. I found myself drawn back to the library after closing hours, using my student ID to slip inside through the side entrance. The building felt different in darkness, alive somehow, breathing with the weight of accumulated knowledge and hidden sorrows. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows between the stacks. As I made my way toward the rare books section, the whispers began again, more insistent now. They seemed to emanate from the basement level, where Margaret had mentioned Rebecca's art supplies were found. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the archives. Boxes of old documents and forgotten manuscripts lined the walls, creating a maze of narrow pathways. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something that made my skin crawl. A soft sob echoed from deeper in the archives. Following the sound, I navigated through towers of moldering boxes until I reached a small study area. There, scattered across an old wooden table, were art supplies, charcoal pencils, sketch pads, and tubes of paint that looked as though they'd been abandoned mid-use. I picked up one of the sketch pads with trembling hands. The pages were filled with drawings of the library, detailed architectural studies that captured every Gothic arch and carved gargoyle. But as I flipped through the pages, the images grew darker. Shadows seemed to move within the sketches, and a recurring figure appeared, a tall man with predatory eyes watching from the corners of each drawing. The final sketch made my blood freeze. It showed the basement archives, but from an impossible perspective, as if drawn by someone trapped within the walls themselves. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in desperate handwriting, were the words, "He won't let me leave." Fascinating work, isn't it? I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Professor David Stone stood at the base of the stairs, his tall frame blocking the only exit. Even in the dim light, I could see the same predatory gleam in his eyes that Rebecca had captured in her sketches. "Professor Stone," I managed, clutching the sketch pad to my chest. "I was just researching," he finished with a cold smile. "Just like Rebecca used to do. She was so dedicated, staying late into the night working on her projects." He moved closer, and I noticed his hands were stained with something dark. She understood the beauty of Gothic architecture, the way shadows can hide so many secrets, but she became too curious about the wrong kind of secrets. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of boxes seemed to close in around us. "What did you do to her?" His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the flickering emergency lighting. "I helped her become part of her art, permanently." The whispers erupted around us then, no longer soft pleadings, but angry accusations. The very air seemed to vibrate with Rebecca's rage. Books tumbled from their shelves, and the temperature plummeted until our breath came out in visible clouds. "She won't let you rest, will she?" I gasped, understanding flooding through me. "Rebecca's spirit, she's been trying to expose you." Professor Stone's composure cracked. She was supposed to disappear quietly, but she keeps interfering. Every semester, she draws another student down here, trying to reveal what happened. A section of boxes suddenly collapsed behind him, revealing a hidden alcove in the wall. My stomach lurched as I saw what lay within. Art supplies arranged around what looked unmistakably like human remains, now little more than bones and scraps of clothing. "Rebecca," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The whispers intensified into a roar of wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Professor Stone stumbled, his eyes wide with terror as invisible hands seemed to grasp at him. The emergency lights failed completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. In that darkness, I felt a presence beside me, gentle but urgent. Rebecca's spirit guided me toward the stairs, her ethereal touch cool against my skin. Behind us, Professor Stone screamed as the weight of his crimes finally caught up with him. I ran through the library, not stopping, until I burst through the main doors into the blessed normalcy of the campus quad. Security guards rushed past me toward the building as my frantic calls brought help at last. Later, investigators would find Professor Stone in the basement archives, catatonic and babbling about shadows that wouldn't leave him alone. Rebecca's remains were recovered and finally given the proper burial she deserved. The investigation revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that had gone undetected for years. But sometimes, late at night when I pass by the library, I swear I can see a figure in the windows, a young woman with kind eyes, finally at peace. The whispers have stopped, replaced by a sense of gratitude that seems to emanate from the very stones of the building. Rebecca's story is over now, her voice finally heard. But her presence lingers in the stacks, a guardian spirit watching over students who work alone in the quiet hours, ensuring that the darkness hiding between the pages never claims another victim. The Gothic arches of the library no longer seem menacing, but protective, sheltering knowledge and those who seek it. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find books moved to exactly where I need them, as if invisible hands are still helping students find their way to the truth. Margaret retired the following semester, but before she left, she gave me a small leather journal. "Rebecca would have wanted you to have this," she said with a knowing smile. Inside, I found Rebecca's final project, not just architectural studies, but a complete documentation of Professor Stone's crimes, evidence she had gathered even as she fought for her life. Her last entry, written in shaking handwriting, simply said, "If you're reading this, then someone finally heard my voice. Thank you." I keep the journal with me always, a reminder that some stories demand to be told, no matter how much darkness tries to silence them. And in the quiet moments between classes, when the library hums with the whispered conversations of countless students who came before, I know that Rebecca is still there, not trapped anymore, but choosing to stay, making sure that knowledge remains a force for justice rather than concealment. The Gothic windows of Riverside University Library catch the morning sun differently now, casting patterns of light instead of shadow. Students still work late into the night among the stacks, but they do so under the protection of a spirit who understands that the truth, once revealed, can never be buried again. Rebecca Morgan's name is engraved on a memorial plaque near the rare books section, honoring her contribution to the safety of future students. But those of us who know the real story understand that her greatest contribution was teaching us to listen, really listen, to the voices that cry out from the darkness. Because sometimes being heard is the only way to find peace. Do you ever feel like something's watching you from the corners? The question drifted through my mind like smoke, settling into the deepest parts of my consciousness. It was the kind of thought that crept up when you least expected it. A whisper of unease that made you check the locks twice before bed. My name is Marcus, and I live in Millbrook, a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they used to. These days, people kept to themselves more, hurrying past each other on the sidewalks with downcast eyes. The old Victorian houses that lined Pine Avenue seemed to lean inward, as if sharing secrets too dark for daylight. I worked at Henderson's Antiques, a dusty shop filled with forgotten treasures and mysterious artifacts. The smell of old wood and aged leather had become my daily perfume, mixing with the faint scent of something I could never quite identify, something metallic and cold. My days followed a familiar rhythm, cataloging items, helping the occasional customer, and wondering why fewer people seemed to venture out after sunset. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in late October. I was closing up the shop when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across glass. At first, I thought it might be tree branches against the storefront windows, but when I looked outside, the night was perfectly still. No wind, no movement, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the glass. That night, sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off only to wake with my heart hammering, certain I'd heard someone calling my name. But each time I sat up in my small apartment above the antique shop, there was nothing but darkness and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. The sound had started to feel less like time passing and more like a countdown. By Thursday, the scratching had become a nightly occurrence. It would start around 11:30, always the same rhythm, always from the same direction. I'd lie in bed, counting the seconds between each scratch, trying to convince myself it was just the old building settling. But buildings don't settle with such deliberate precision. The morning after a particularly restless night, I decided to investigate. I walked around the entire building, examining every window, every surface where something might have left marks. What I found made my blood run cold. Thin scratches, barely visible in the daylight, traced patterns across the back window of the shop. They weren't random, they formed symbols, crude but unmistakably intentional. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Ruth's voice startled me as I sat hunched over my coffee at Millbrook Cafe. Ruth had been serving coffee and comfort to the town for over 20 years, and she had a way of reading people that was both reassuring and unnerving. "Just some noise keeping me up," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. The cafe was busier than usual for a Friday afternoon, but conversations were hushed, urgent. I caught fragments. "Disappeared Tuesday night. Police don't have any leads. Third one this month." "You mean you haven't heard?" Ruth leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Danny Morrison went missing 3 nights ago, just vanished from his apartment. Door was wide open, but nothing was taken. It's like he just walked out into the night and never came back." Danny, my stomach dropped. He'd been a regular customer at the antique shop, always looking for old books about local history. We talked about the town's past, about the old sanatorium that had closed down in the 1970s after a series of unexplained incidents. Danny had been particularly interested in the records from that time, claiming he was writing a paper on mental health facilities in rural America. "When did you last see him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Monday afternoon. He came in here asking about the Millbrook Sanatorium, wanted to know if anyone still had keys to the place." Ruth's eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting to see something lurking outside. "I told him to leave well enough alone. Some places are better left undisturbed." That evening I couldn't concentrate on anything. The scratching sounds seemed to come earlier, more insistent. Around 10 o'clock, I gave up trying to read and decided to take a walk. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that reminded me of hospitals and old medicine. Pine Avenue was deserted, streetlights casting pools of yellow light that seemed to shrink rather than illuminate. As I walked, I became aware of footsteps behind me, matching my pace perfectly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I turned around, the street was empty, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I quickened my pace, heading toward the edge of town, where the old sanatorium stood silhouetted against the starless sky. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up and walls covered in ivy that looked black in the moonlight. But as I approached, I noticed something that made me freeze. One of the ground floor windows was no longer boarded up. Faint light flickered from within, casting shifting shadows on the overgrown lawn. And there, standing in that window, was a figure I almost recognized, tall, slender, with movements that seemed just slightly off, as if they were underwater. "You shouldn't be here alone." The voice came from behind me, and I spun around to see a woman emerging from the shadows. She was probably in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that reflected an intelligence sharpened by fear. "My name is Diana. I've been watching the sanatorium for weeks." Watching it, why? My heart was still racing from the surprise. "Because people keep disappearing, and this place is connected." She moved closer, and I could see the exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from too many sleepless nights. "My brother was one of the first to vanish. He'd been researching the sanatorium's history, just like your friend Danny." "You know about Danny?" "I know about all of them." Her voice carried a weight of grief and determination. 7 people in the last 2 months. All of them had some connection to this place. Either they were researching it, or they lived in houses that used to belong to former staff members, or they'd found artifacts from the old hospital. I thought about the antique shop, about the strange items that had been coming in lately. Old medical instruments, tarnished jewelry, books with pages that felt damp no matter how long they'd been stored. What kind of artifacts? Things that should have been destroyed when they closed the sanatorium. Personal belongings of patients who died there, medical records, and this. She pulled out a small metal object from her jacket, an old key, ornate and somehow menacing in the moonlight. This was my brother's. He found it in our grandmother's attic. She used to work as a nurse here in the 1960s. The key seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, and I found myself stepping back involuntarily. What does it open? The basement level, the part of the sanatorium they sealed off after the incidents. Diana's eyes never left the building. The part where they kept the patients they couldn't help, the ones they experimented on. My grandmother left journals hidden in her house. What they did down there. It wasn't medicine. It was something else entirely. A sound drifted from the sanatorium, low, mournful, like voices singing in a language that predated words. Diana grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. It's starting again. They're calling to the missing people, trying to add them to whatever they've become. We have to go in there, I said, surprising myself with my resolve. If there's any chance Danny and the others are still alive. They're not alive, Diana interrupted, her voice flat. Not anymore. But their souls might still be trapped, and if we don't stop this, it'll keep spreading. The darkness feeds on isolation, on people who have connections to the sanatorium's past. It's been growing stronger. We approached the building together, the key heavy in Diana's hand. The front entrance was chained shut, but she led me around to a side door that stood slightly ajar. The metal was cold to the touch, and when we pushed it open, the hinges screamed like something in pain. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and disinfectant, a combination that turned my stomach. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting everything in a hellish red glow. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, but beneath it all, I could make out older markings, symbols similar to the ones I'd found scratched on my window. The basement is this way, Diana whispered, pulling out a flashlight. Our footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as we made our way deeper into the building. With each step, the temperature seemed to drop, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of the flashlight. We found the stairs leading down, and Diana inserted the key into a rusted lock that shouldn't have still been functional after all these years. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The basement was worse than I'd imagined. Rows of cells lined the walls, their doors hanging open like mouths. But it was what occupied the center of the room that made me understand the true horror of what we faced. A circle of chairs surrounded an old medical table, and in each chair sat a figure I recognized from missing person posters around town. They weren't moving, weren't breathing, but their eyes followed us as we entered. Danny was there, along with 6 others, all sitting perfectly still with expressions of terrible awareness. They were trapped, conscious, but unable to move or speak, their life force slowly being drained by something that pulsed with malevolent energy above the medical table. The source, Diana breathed, and I followed her gaze upward to see it. A writhing mass of shadow and electricity that seemed to exist partially in our reality and partially somewhere else. It fed through tendrils of darkness that connected to each of the trapped victims, growing stronger with every passing moment. How do we stop it? I asked, though I could barely form the words. The symbols, Diana said, pointing to markings carved into the floor around the circle of chairs. They're binding spells, keeping the victims connected to the entity. If we can break the pattern. Before she could finish, the thing above us shifted, and suddenly the air filled with whispers and voices I recognized. Danny's voice, pleading for help. My grandmother's voice, though she'd been dead for years. Voices of people I'd known, people I'd loved, all of them begging me to join them, to let the darkness take away the pain of living. I felt my resolve wavering, the voices so real, so convincing. But Diana grabbed my arm again, her touch anchoring me to reality. Don't listen. It's trying to weaken us before it feeds. Together, we began working on the symbols, using pieces of broken concrete to scratch away the carved lines. With each mark we destroyed, the entity above us writhed more violently, and the whispers turned to screams. The trapped victim's eyes began to show signs of life, hope flickering in their expressions. But the entity wasn't going to let us succeed without a fight. Shadows began to pour from the walls, reaching for us with tendrils that burned like ice when they touched skin. I felt something wrap around my ankle, trying to drag me toward the circle, but Diana pulled me back. "Keep going," she shouted over the growing cacophony. "We're almost there." The final symbol was the largest, carved deep into the concrete at the center of the circle. As we attacked it together, the entity let out a sound that was part shriek, part explosion. The basement filled with blinding light, and I felt myself being thrown backward against the wall. When the light faded and the ringing in my ears subsided, the basement was silent. The chairs were empty, the victims gone, and the oppressive presence that had filled the air was nowhere to be felt. But on the medical table lay 7 still forms, the missing people, finally at peace. Diana and I sat in the wreckage for a long time, neither of us speaking. Finally, she broke the silence. "It's over, but it's not finished. There will be others who remember this place, others who might accidentally awaken something similar. We need to make sure people know what to watch for." "How do we convince them?" I asked. "Who's going to believe a story like this?" "We start with the people who have noticed things, the ones who have felt the watching eyes, heard the whispers. We build a network of people who understand that some darkness never really goes away. It just waits for the right moment to return." Over the following weeks, Diana and I did exactly that. We reached out to residents who'd reported strange experiences, people who'd lost family members or friends under mysterious circumstances. Jake, a local journalist who'd been investigating the disappearances, became our first ally. He helped us document everything, creating records that future generations could reference if the darkness ever stirred again. Ruth at the cafe became another crucial contact, using her position as the town's unofficial information hub to identify people who might be at risk. We established a system of check-ins, making sure no one stayed isolated for too long, because isolation was what the entity had fed on most. The antique shop became our unofficial headquarters. I learned to recognize items that carried traces of the sanatorium's dark history, and instead of selling them, I secured them in a special room that Diana and I warded with symbols we'd researched from her grandmother's journals. Millbrook slowly returned to something resembling normal life, but it was a new kind of normal, one where people looked out for each other, where strange occurrences were reported rather than ignored, where the community understood that some threats required collective vigilance. On quiet evenings, when I closed up the shop and walked home along Pine Avenue, I sometimes caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. But instead of fear, I felt prepared. The darkness might return someday in some new form, but it would not find us isolated and vulnerable. Diana and I maintained our partnership, meeting weekly to review reports and investigate any unusual incidents. We'd become the town's unofficial guardians, protectors against things that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. The scratching sounds never returned to my window, but sometimes, on particularly still nights, I thought I could hear something else. The sound of people talking, sharing stories, staying connected. It was the sound of a community that had learned the value of standing together against the dark. And in that sound, I found something I'd never expected: hope. Not just hope that we could survive whatever threatened us, but hope that we could thrive, that we could build something stronger than the sum of its parts, something that even the deepest darkness couldn't tear apart. The old sanatorium still stood on the edge of town, but it was no longer a source of fear. It had become a reminder of what we'd overcome together, a monument to the power of community in the face of unimaginable horror. As I settled into my routine of vigilance and connection, I realized that our victory hadn't been in destroying the entity. It had been in refusing to let it isolate us from each other. The real power had always been in the bonds between people, in the simple act of refusing to face the darkness alone. The town of Millbrook had learned that lesson well, and we would never forget it. In a world where shadows could take on lives of their own, where ancient hungers could awaken after decades of slumber, the most powerful weapon we possessed was each other. And that was something no darkness, no matter how deep or ancient, could ever take away from us. Do you ever wonder how many lies we tell ourselves each day? The question drifted across the marble table like smoke from an extinguished candle. I had just concluded a presentation at the upscale bistro downtown. The gentle hum of classical music and soft conversations creating a sophisticated backdrop. My pulse still raced from the adrenaline of pitching our new venture, a mixture of excitement and nervous energy coursing through my veins. But Marcus's words cut through my euphoria like a blade through silk. I studied Marcus across the table, his composed exterior masking something darker beneath. He possessed an almost magnetic confidence that drew people in, yet something about his pale green eyes unsettled me deeply. They seemed to hold secrets that danced just beyond my comprehension. "That's an odd question," I replied, attempting to keep my voice light as I sipped my espresso. The bitter liquid did nothing to ease the growing tension in my chest. Marcus tilted his head slightly, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Business partnerships are built on trust, but trust itself is often an illusion. People wear masks, especially when money is involved. I couldn't dismiss the feeling that his words carried weight beyond casual conversation. My stomach tightened as I glanced around the bistro, taking in the familiar sights. A young woman typing furiously on her laptop, an elderly couple sharing dessert. Yet everything felt strangely distorted, as if I were viewing the world through a funhouse mirror. As we prepared to leave, I noticed a woman in dark sunglasses sitting alone near the entrance. Despite the dimly lit interior, she hadn't removed them. When our eyes met, she held my gaze for several heartbeats too long, sending an uncomfortable chill down my spine. I quickly looked away, focusing on Marcus's voice as he discussed tomorrow's meeting. "Let's reconvene at the parking space tomorrow morning," Marcus suggested, rising gracefully from his chair. "I have some documents that will interest you." I nodded, forcing enthusiasm into my voice, though my thoughts remained fixed on the mysterious woman. Stepping into the cool evening air, I felt exposed and vulnerable. The city lights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and I found myself checking over my shoulder repeatedly as I walked toward my apartment. Each footstep echoed louder than it should have, and the familiar streets seemed somehow foreign and threatening. The sensation of being watched intensified with every block. Street lamps flickered overhead, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance and writhe. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering against my ribs until I finally reached the safety of my building. Inside my apartment, I double-locked the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Perhaps I was overreacting, I told myself. New business ventures always brought uncertainty and stress. But Marcus's cryptic comments continued to echo in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Later that evening, as I attempted to unwind, I found myself researching Marcus online. What I discovered made my blood run cold. An article from 3 years ago detailed a corporate scandal involving embezzlement and money laundering. While Marcus wasn't directly named, the company he had worked for was at the center of the investigation. Several executives had disappeared before charges could be filed. My phone buzzed, startling me from my research. A text from Marcus appeared on the screen. "Meet me at the old textile factory on Industrial Boulevard. Something urgent has come up." I stared at the message, my hands trembling slightly. The textile factory had been abandoned for years, a decaying monument to the city's industrial past. Why would he want to meet there? "It's nearly midnight," I typed back. "This can't wait. Trust me, you need to see what I've found." Against every instinct screaming at me to stay home, I found myself getting dressed and heading out into the night. The streets were eerily quiet, devoid of the usual urban energy. Streetlights cast pools of sickly yellow light that seemed to emphasize the darkness rather than dispel it. The textile factory loomed before me like a sleeping giant, its broken windows staring down like empty eye sockets. Rust stains streaked down the brick walls like tears, and weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation. I parked and approached the main entrance, my footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. "Marcus," I called out, my voice swallowed by the cavernous space. "Back here," came his reply from somewhere deep within the building. I followed the sound, using my phone's flashlight to navigate through the maze of abandoned machinery and fallen beams. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Every shadow seemed to harbor potential threats, and I jumped at every creak and groan of the old structure. I found Marcus in what had once been the factory's office space, hunched over a laptop surrounded by scattered papers. The blue glow of the screen cast eerie shadows across his face, making him look almost ghostly. "Thank you for coming," he said without looking up. "I know this seems extreme, but what I've uncovered changes everything." "What are you talking about?" I asked, moving closer despite my reservations. He gestured to the laptop screen, which displayed a complex web of financial transactions and corporate connections. "Our potential investor, the one backing our project, isn't who he claims to be. He's the front man for a network that's been laundering money through legitimate businesses for over a decade." My mouth went dry as I studied the information. Names, dates, and dollar amounts created a damning pattern of corruption that stretched far beyond anything I had imagined. "How did you get all this?" I whispered. "I have my sources," Marcus replied cryptically. "But here's the real problem. We're already in too deep. They know we're asking questions." A cold wave of fear washed over me. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, a loud crash echoed through the factory, the sound of metal hitting concrete. We both froze, listening intently. Heavy footsteps began approaching our location, slow and deliberate. "We need to leave." "Now," Marcus hissed, quickly gathering the papers and shutting the laptop. But as we moved toward what we thought was an exit, a figure appeared in the doorway, a young man. maybe 17 or 18, with wild eyes and clothes torn from running through the industrial debris. "Don't go out there," he gasped, his voice cracking with terror. "They're everywhere. They've been watching you." "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "It doesn't matter," the teenager panted. "What matters is that you're all in danger. They know you have the files." Another crash, closer this time, made us all jump. The sound of multiple sets of footsteps echoed through the factory, growing louder and more numerous. "This way," Marcus said, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a window on the far side of the room. "What about him?" I pointed to the terrified young man. "He'll have to find his own way out," Marcus replied coldly, his survival instinct overriding any compassion. I hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the moral obligation to help someone clearly in distress. But as the footsteps grew closer and voices began calling out through the darkness, Marcus yanked me toward the window. We climbed through the broken frame, cutting ourselves on jagged glass in our haste to escape. The cool night air hit us like a slap, and we ran across the empty lot toward our car, adrenaline pumping through our veins. Behind us, shouts erupted from the factory, and I could see flashlight beams sweeping through the broken windows. We reached the car just as figures emerged from the building, their faces obscured by the darkness. Marcus gunned the engine, and we tore out of the lot, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I watched the factory recede into the distance, but I couldn't shake the image of the terrified teenager we had left behind. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Somewhere safe," Marcus replied, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I know someone who can help us." We drove through the empty streets, taking a circuitous route that Marcus claimed would throw off any potential followers. The city looked different in the dead of night, more sinister, more threatening. Every car that appeared in our mirrors seemed suspicious, every pedestrian a potential threat. Finally, we pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue shadows across the cracked asphalt. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, where questions weren't asked, and cash was the only currency that mattered. "Wait here," Marcus instructed, getting out of the car. He approached the motel office while I sat in the passenger seat, my mind racing with questions and fears. What had we stumbled into? How deep did this conspiracy go? And most importantly, could I trust Marcus? He returned a few minutes later with a key. "Room 12, he said. "It's not much, but it'll keep us off the grid for now." The motel room was exactly what I expected: faded wallpaper, musty carpets, and furniture that had seen better decades. But it felt safe, or at least safer than anywhere else we could go. Marcus spread the documents across the small table, and we began piecing together the full scope of what we had uncovered. The financial records painted a picture of a vast criminal enterprise that used legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering, tax evasion, and worse. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a series of transactions. "Every month, millions of dollars flow through these accounts. And here, he indicated another section. These are the businesses being used as covers. Restaurants, construction companies, even charities." The scale of the operation was staggering. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Years, maybe decades," Marcus replied grimly. "And we've accidentally positioned ourselves right in the middle of it." A knock at the door made us both freeze. 3 sharp raps, followed by silence. Marcus and I exchanged glances, neither of us breathing. "Expecting someone," I whispered. He shook his head, moving cautiously toward the window to peer through the blinds. "I don't see anyone," he said softly. Another knock, more insistent this time. Then a voice called out, "Marcus, it's Jack, open up." Marcus's posture relaxed slightly. "It's okay," he said. "This is my contact, the one I told you about." He opened the door to reveal a man in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. Jack had the weathered appearance of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. His clothes were rumpled, and he carried himself with the weary confidence of a former law enforcement officer. "You look like hell," Jack said, stepping into the room and surveying our makeshift headquarters. "We've had a rough night," Marcus replied, closing and locking the door behind him. Jack's eyes swept over the documents spread across the table, and his expression grew grave. "Jesus, Marcus, what have you gotten yourself into?" "We stumbled onto something big," I interjected. "Bigger than we ever imagined." Jack picked up one of the financial records, studying it carefully. "This is serious stuff. These aren't small-time crooks you're dealing with. This network has connections everywhere: police, government, even federal agencies." My heart sank. "So there's no one we can trust?" "There are a few," Jack said slowly. "But we have to be very careful about how we proceed. One wrong move, and you'll both end up like that kid at the factory." "What kid?" Marcus asked sharply. Jack gave him a look that chilled me to the bone. "The one they found an hour ago, shot twice in the head." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit. The weight of what Jack had just told us settled over me like a lead blanket. The terrified teenager we had encountered, the one we had left behind, was dead. "We have to go to the authorities," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "With what?" Jack asked. "Some financial records and a story about mysterious figures in an abandoned factory. They'll bury this so deep you'll never see daylight again." "Then what do we do?" Marcus demanded. Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the practiced eye of someone who understood the criminal mind. "We need more evidence," he said finally. "Concrete proof that can't be dismissed or covered up. And we need to move fast before they realize how much you know." "How do we get more evidence without getting killed?" I asked. "Very carefully," Jack replied, "and with my help." He explained that he had contacts within various agencies, people who had grown tired of watching corruption flourish, while justice took a backseat to politics and money. It would be dangerous, but there was a chance we could expose the network and bring down some very powerful people. "What's the plan?" Marcus asked. "First, we need to get you somewhere safer than this," Jack said. "Then we start building an airtight case. But you need to understand, once we start down this path, there's no going back. These people don't just ruin careers, they end lives." I looked at Marcus, searching his face for any sign of doubt or deception. Despite everything that had happened, despite the questions that remained about his past, I found myself trusting him. We were in this together now, bound by shared danger and a common goal. "We're in," I said, speaking for both of us. Marcus nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Whatever it takes." Jack gathered up the documents, securing them in a worn leather briefcase. "Then we move tonight. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely they are to find us." As we prepared to leave the motel room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above the dresser. I looked older somehow, as if the events of the past few hours had aged me years. The person staring back at me was no longer the naive entrepreneur who had walked into that bistro earlier in the day. That person had been replaced by someone harder, more wary, shaped by the sudden understanding that the world was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. We slipped out of the motel under cover of darkness, three figures moving through shadows toward an uncertain future. The night air was cool against my skin, but I felt a fire burning inside me, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. The road ahead would be treacherous, filled with enemies we couldn't see and allies we couldn't fully trust. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we had a fighting chance. As we disappeared into the maze of city streets, I couldn't help but think about the teenager who had tried to warn us. His death would not be in vain. We would expose the truth, tear down the network of corruption, and make sure that justice finally prevailed. The shadows that had seemed so threatening now felt like our protection, concealing us from those who would do us harm, while we gathered the strength and evidence needed to strike back. The war had begun, and we intended to win it. Have you ever felt like you were walking into something you couldn't escape? That question haunted me as I stood in the narrow hallway of Thornfield Manor, a converted Victorian apartment building in downtown Portland. The aged wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet with each step. I had moved here 6 months ago, drawn by the reasonable rent and the building's old-world charm. As a freelance journalist, I appreciated the quiet atmosphere that helped me focus on my work. But everything changed when he arrived. Damien Grace moved in on a Tuesday night in late October. His belongings carried up the creaking stairs by shadowy figures who spoke in hushed tones. I caught glimpses of them through my peephole, men in dark coats carrying wooden crates and canvas-wrapped bundles that seemed far too heavy for their size. The whole process took hours, extending well past midnight, and the sound of shuffling feet and muffled voices drifted through the thin walls. At first, I dismissed it as typical moving day chaos. New neighbors were nothing unusual in a building like this, where tenants came and went like seasons. But there was something different about this one. Damien kept to himself, avoiding eye contact whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. He was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see right through you. His clothes were always impeccable, tailored suits, and expensive shoes that clicked against the hardwood floors with military precision. The first strange incident occurred exactly 1 week after his arrival. I was working late on an article about urban development when I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a mixture of human voices and something else, something that made my skin crawl. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the hum of my laptop, but gradually grew louder and more insistent. I pressed my ear against the shared wall between our apartments, my heart pounding as the chanting continued. The words were unintelligible, spoken in what sounded like an ancient language, but the tone was unmistakably ceremonial. There was a hypnotic quality to it, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't return. When I finally pulled away from the wall, I noticed a strange smell, incense mixed with something metallic and unpleasant. It clung to the air like smoke, making my eyes water and my throat burn. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the memory of those voices echoing in my mind. I tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps he was a religious man, or maybe he practiced meditation. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. The sound had been too otherworldly, too filled with dark purpose to be dismissed as harmless ritual. Days passed, and the incidents became more frequent. The chanting would begin at random hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day when I was trying to work. The smell of incense became a constant presence in the hallway, so strong that other tenants began to complain. Mrs. Patterson from the first floor mentioned it to Mr. Carmichael, the building manager, but he seemed oddly reluctant to address the issue. "Some people have different customs," he said with a shrug when I brought it up. "As long as he pays his rent on time and doesn't damage the property, I don't see the problem." But I could see the problem clearly. The building itself seemed to be changing, becoming darker and more oppressive with each passing day. The hallway lights flickered constantly, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. The temperature dropped noticeably near Damien's apartment, and I often found myself shivering as I walked past his door. My work began to suffer as my concentration wavered. I found myself constantly distracted, listening for sounds from next door, watching for signs of activity. I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence, every unusual smell, every moment when the building felt different. The journalist in me demanded answers, but the human in me was terrified of what I might discover. The breakthrough came when I decided to research the building's history. I spent hours in the Portland Public Library, digging through old newspapers and city records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Thornfield Manor had been built in 1892 by a wealthy industrialist named Jonathan Thornfield. But Thornfield had been involved in the occult, hosting seances and spiritual gatherings that had scandalized Portland society. The newspaper articles from that era painted a picture of a man obsessed with contacting the dead, spending vast sums on rare books and artifacts related to the supernatural. The building had been designed according to his specifications, with hidden passages and rooms specifically created for occult purposes. After Thornfield's mysterious death in 1898, the property had changed hands multiple times, with each owner reporting strange phenomena before eventually selling. Armed with this knowledge, I began to piece together a disturbing picture. Damien hadn't chosen this apartment randomly. He had sought it out specifically because of its history. The building's dark past was exactly what he was looking for, and he was using it for purposes that I was only beginning to understand. My investigation took on a new urgency. I started paying closer attention to Damien's comings and goings, noting the times when the chanting was loudest, the days when the smell of incense was strongest. I noticed that he received packages regularly, old books, wooden boxes, and containers that seemed to contain liquids or powders. The delivery men who brought these packages always looked nervous, as if they couldn't wait to leave. One evening, as I was returning from a late dinner with Emma, my colleague at the Portland Tribune, I encountered Damien in the hallway. He was carrying a large, leather-bound book under his arm, and his clothes smelled strongly of smoke and herbs. "Good evening, Michael," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "How are you finding the building?" "It's interesting," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Rich with history." His eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Ah, you've been doing research." I thought I recognized the look of someone who had been digging into the past. He shifted the book to his other arm, and I caught a glimpse of strange symbols carved into the leather cover. History has a way of repeating itself, don't you think? "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The building remembers," he said simply. "The walls hold memories, and sometimes, if you know how to listen, they'll share their secrets." He paused, studying my face intently. "You've been listening, haven't you, Michael? I can see it in your eyes." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Of course you are," he said with a knowing smile. "You're a journalist. It's your nature to seek the truth, even when that truth might be uncomfortable." He took a step closer, and I caught the full force of the strange odors that clung to him: incense, old paper, and something else that made my stomach turn. "Would you like to know what I'm really doing here?" Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. "Yes," I heard myself say. "Then perhaps you should join me tomorrow evening," he said. 8 o'clock. I think you'll find it enlightening." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into his apartment, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with the echo of his words ringing in my ears. I stood there for several minutes, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave Portland immediately. But the journalist in me knew I had to see this through. The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I tried to work, but found myself constantly checking the clock, watching the hours crawl by until evening. I called Emma and told her about my encounter with Damien, but she just laughed it off. "You're probably just dealing with some eccentric artist or new age enthusiast," she said. "Portland is full of them. Remember that guy who claimed he could communicate with houseplants?" But I knew this was different. The research I had done, the history of the building, the strange occurrences, it all pointed to something far more serious than artistic eccentricity. As 8 o'clock approached, I found myself standing outside Damien's door, my hand raised to knock, my heart pounding in my chest. The door opened before I could knock, as if he had been waiting for me. "Michael," he said with a warm smile, "right on time, please come in." I stepped into his apartment and immediately felt the difference. The air was thick with incense and something else, a metallic tang that made my mouth water unpleasantly. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with ancient-looking volumes, and the floor was covered with intricate rugs that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. "Welcome to my sanctuary," Damien said, closing the door behind me. "I've been working on something quite special, and I think you'll appreciate the historical significance." The main room had been transformed into something that belonged in a museum rather than a Portland apartment. Antique furniture was arranged in careful patterns, and the walls were decorated with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. In the center of the room, a large circle had been drawn on the floor with what looked like chalk. though the symbols within it were unlike anything I had ever seen. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is where history and the present intersect," Damien replied, moving to a table covered with candles and strange instruments. "Jonathan Thornfield was ahead of his time, you know. He understood that the boundary between worlds is thinner than most people realize. I'm simply continuing his work." I felt a growing sense of unease as I took in the scene. "What kind of work?" "Communication," he said simply. "There are entities that exist beyond our normal perception, beings that have knowledge and power beyond our understanding. Thornfield made contact with them over a century ago, and I've been working to reestablish that connection." The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to leave, to run as fast as I could back to my apartment and lock the door. But I found myself rooted to the spot, fascinated despite my fear. "You're talking about ghosts." "Something far more complex than that," Damien said, lighting a series of candles arranged around the circle. "These entities exist in a realm parallel to our own, separated by barriers that can be crossed under the right circumstances. Thornfield discovered the method, but his death interrupted the process. I've spent years studying his notes, preparing for this moment." As he spoke, he began to arrange objects within the circle: crystals, old coins, and what appeared to be small bones. The smell of incense grew stronger, and I noticed that the temperature in the room was dropping steadily. "This is insane," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Damien asked, looking up from his preparations. "You've felt it too, haven't you? The building's energy, the way it responds to certain activities. This place is special, Michael. It's a nexus point, a location where the barriers between worlds are naturally weak." I couldn't deny that I had felt something, the strange atmospheres, the way the building seemed to have a presence of its own. But this was beyond anything I had imagined. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to witness," he said, "to document what happens here. You're a journalist, and this is the story of a lifetime. The first recorded contact with entities from another realm in over a century." Before I could respond, he began to chant in the same ancient language I had heard through the walls. The sound filled the room, reverberating off the walls and floor, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing in patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of his voice. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath in the air. The symbols on the floor began to glow with a faint, pulsing light, and I felt a pressure building in my ears as if I were deep underwater. The chanting grew louder and more insistent, and I found myself swaying slightly, caught up in the hypnotic rhythm. Then something began to happen within the circle. The air shimmered like heat waves on a summer day, and shapes began to form, vague, shifting outlines that seemed to exist at the edge of perception. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the shapes remained, growing more solid with each passing moment. "Do you see them?" Damien asked, his voice strained with excitement. "They're coming through." I did see them, and the sight filled me with a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. The entities were roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. They moved with a fluid grace that defied physics, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were indistinct, but I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "This is impossible," I whispered. But even as I spoke, I knew I was witnessing something real, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. "Nothing is impossible," Damien replied, his voice filled with awe. "They've been waiting for so long, trapped between worlds, seeking a way to cross over. Thornfield opened the door, but it was closed before they could pass through. Now, finally, they have another chance." The entities began to move closer to the edge of the circle, and I could feel their presence pressing against my mind like cold fingers. They were trying to communicate, I realized, but their thoughts were alien, filled with concepts and emotions that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. "They're in pain," I said, the words coming out without conscious thought. "They've been trapped for so long, they're desperate to escape." "Yes," Damien said, his eyes shining with fanatic fervor. "And we're going to help them. We're going to complete what Thornfield started and give them the freedom they've been seeking." But as he spoke, I began to understand the true horror of what was happening. These entities weren't simply seeking freedom, they were hungry. They had been trapped between worlds for over a century, and their hunger had grown beyond anything that could be satisfied by mere food or energy. They wanted to exist, to feel, to experience the physical world that had been denied to them for so long. And they were willing to take whatever they needed to achieve that goal. "We have to stop this," I said, backing toward the door. "This is too dangerous." But Damien was no longer listening to me. He was completely absorbed in his ritual, his chanting becoming more frenzied as the entities grew more solid. The circle that had been containing them was beginning to weaken, the lines of chalk starting to blur and fade. "The barrier is breaking down," he said, his voice filled with triumph. "They're almost through." I could see that he was right. The entities were becoming more substantial with each passing moment, their forms taking on weight and presence. The air in the room was becoming thick and oppressive, and I could feel their alien thoughts pressing against my consciousness like a physical weight. That's when I realized the truth. Damien had no control over what he was unleashing. He thought he was communicating with these beings, but he was actually being manipulated by them. They had been influencing him, guiding his research, pushing him toward this moment when they could finally break free from their prison. "Damien, you have to stop," I shouted, grabbing his arm. "You're not controlling them, they're controlling you." But it was too late. The chalk circle had completely dissolved, and the entities were free to move beyond its boundaries. They flowed toward us like liquid shadow, their forms solidifying as they approached. I felt their cold touch on my skin, and my vision began to blur as their alien thoughts invaded my mind. "Run," I screamed, pushing Damien toward the door. "We have to get out of here." But he was entranced, staring at the entities with the rapture of a man who had achieved his life's goal. "They're beautiful," he whispered. "Can't you see how beautiful they are?" I couldn't see beauty in those shifting, alien forms. All I could see was hunger, an endless, consuming need that would never be satisfied. I grabbed Damien's shoulders and shook him hard, trying to break through his trance. "They're not beautiful," I shouted. "They're parasites. They're going to drain everything from this world." For a moment his eyes cleared, and I saw recognition dawn in his face. "Oh God," he whispered, "what have I done?" The entities were fully materialized now, their forms solid and threatening. They moved with purpose, reaching out with appendages that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. I felt their touch on my mind, and images flooded my consciousness. visions of a world drained of life, of cities turned to dust, of humanity reduced to empty shells. "The door," I yelled, pulling Damien toward the exit. "We have to warn everyone." But as we reached the door, I realized that it was already too late. The entities had spread throughout the building, their presence seeping through the walls and floors. I could hear screams from the other apartments, the sounds of terror and confusion as other tenants encountered the creatures that had been unleashed. We burst into the hallway, and I saw Mrs. Patterson standing frozen at the foot of the stairs, staring at something that my eyes couldn't quite focus on. Her face was pale with shock, and she was making small, whimpering sounds deep in her throat. "We have to evacuate the building," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it was hopeless. The entities weren't confined to Damien's apartment. They were everywhere, spreading through the building like a virus. "I can send them back," Damien said, his voice filled with desperate hope. "If I can reverse the ritual, I can close the gateway." But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it himself. The entities had been planning this for over a century, and they weren't going to give up their freedom easily. They had found a way into our world, and they intended to stay. As we stood in the hallway, surrounded by the chaos and terror that had been unleashed, I realized that this was just the beginning. The entities were free now, and they were hungry for everything our world had to offer. They had waited patiently for their opportunity, and now that it had come, they were going to make the most of it. The building shook around us, and I could feel the presence of the entities growing stronger. They were adapting, learning, becoming more adept at existing in our reality. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear their thoughts, alien, hungry, and utterly without mercy. I had sought the truth about my mysterious neighbor, and I had found it. But the truth was far more terrible than anything I could have imagined. Damien Grace hadn't just been practicing occult rituals. He had been preparing for an invasion. And now, as the entities spread throughout the building and beyond, I realized that the nightmare was just beginning. The last thing I remembered before the darkness took me was the sound of their laughter, cold, alien, and filled with the promise of horrors yet to come. What if the echoes of the past refuse to fade? What if they wait in the shadows, desperate to tell their story to anyone willing to listen? These thoughts consumed me as I stood at the edge of the construction zone, breathing in the thick Louisiana air mixed with dust and the scent of old brick. I'm David, a local historian who specializes in preserving the forgotten stories of New Orleans. And today, I had come to witness the final hours of the old Roosevelt Hotel. The grand structure had stood empty for 40 years, its Art Deco facade crumbling like ancient parchment in the humid southern heat. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the cracked sidewalk where weeds pushed through concrete. There was something unsettling about the stillness that hung over the site, a tension that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the city's heartbeat. As I moved closer, the distant rumble of demolition equipment filled the air, but beneath it all, I could swear I heard something else, a faint whisper that drifted on the breeze like a forgotten song. I paused, scanning the empty windows of the hotel. Was someone still inside? "David, over here," a voice called out, breaking through my concentration. It was Rebecca, the project supervisor. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her work clothes were already streaked with the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this part of the French Quarter. "You ready to document this piece of history?" "As ready as anyone can be," I replied, forcing a smile despite the unease that had settled in my chest. But as I followed her deeper into the construction zone, those whispers seemed to grow fainter, replaced by an overwhelming sense of being observed. The demolition crew was making final preparations, their massive machines positioned like metal beasts ready to devour the past. I pulled out my notebook and began jotting down observations about the hotel's history. Built in 1922, it had been the crown jewel of the jazz district, a place where musicians, writers, and dreamers had gathered to create magic. Unfortunately, it had also been the site of unexplained tragedies that locals still whispered about in hushed tones. As the sun began its descent toward the Mississippi River, the light started to change. Shadows stretched longer, reaching across the construction site like dark fingers grasping for something just out of reach. The familiar surroundings suddenly felt foreign and threatening. My attention was drawn to an ornate door, partially buried beneath a pile of debris near what had once been the hotel's grand staircase. Something about it seemed deliberately preserved, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I found myself walking toward it, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. The metal handle was ice cold despite the sweltering heat, and touching it sent a chill racing down my spine. Just then, the demolition equipment roared to life, drowning out everything else. "David," Rebecca's voice cut through the mechanical noise. "You need to get back. We're starting the final phase." I nodded and stepped away, my heart still pounding from whatever I had just experienced. As the first wrecking ball swung toward the building, I felt a wave of overwhelming dread wash over me. The air seemed to thicken around us, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard a woman's voice crying out through the chaos. But the sound vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the hollow echo of destruction. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on my documentation. The machinery rumbled closer, and as metal met brick, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to dart away from the light. "David, you okay?" Rebecca's voice brought me back to reality. "Yeah, just processing all this," I answered, though the feeling of unease was settling deeper into my bones. As the demolition continued, my eyes kept returning to that mysterious door. There was something about it that called to me, curiosity mixing with an inexplicable fear. What secrets had this place kept hidden? What stories lay buried beneath decades of neglect? The sound of crumbling masonry filled the air, and through the settling dust, I spotted something dark nestled in the debris. What appeared to be a small, weathered journal bound in cracked leather. "Rebecca, I think I found something important," I called out, excitement overriding my earlier apprehension. She hurried over, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it now?" I knelt down and carefully brushed away the dust and fragments of brick. The journal was fragile, its cover embossed with faded gold lettering that was barely visible. "It looks like a diary from the hotel's early days," I said, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with elegant handwriting that spoke of a different era. As I scanned the entries, a chill ran through me. The words described sorrow, loss, and a presence that had tormented the writer. "I cannot escape the feeling of being watched," one entry read. "The voices call to me in the darkness of night." A shiver coursed through my body. Was this connected to the unease I had been feeling? "David, what's wrong?" Rebecca's voice seemed to come from far away. "This journal, I think it might explain what happened here," I said. But before I could elaborate, the ground beneath us began to shake. The demolition equipment was pushing deeper into the structure, and a loud crack echoed across the site. I looked up in horror as part of the hotel's facade began to give way. "Everyone back," Rebecca shouted, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the journal tightly as dust and debris filled the air around us. In that moment of chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and restless was stirring beneath the ruins of the past. As we retreated to safety, I held the journal close to my chest, feeling its weight like a responsibility I couldn't ignore. What had I uncovered, and what shadows were waiting to emerge from the echoes of the Roosevelt? The dust settled slowly around us, swirling like memories trying to take shape. I gripped the journal so tightly my knuckles turned white, the echo of the collapse still ringing in my ears, a stark reminder of how fragile the barrier between past and present really was. "David, are you hurt?" Rebecca's voice cut through the haze of confusion. She stood a few feet away, her face pale as she surveyed the damage. "No, I'm okay," I replied, though my heart was racing and anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. "Just shaken up." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of forgotten history was pressing down on us. My gaze drifted back to the journal, its pages seeming to whisper secrets I felt compelled to understand. Rebecca approached, her expression mixing concern with curiosity. "What exactly did you find in there?" "It's a diary from someone who lived or worked at the Roosevelt," I explained, my voice slightly unsteady. "It describes strange occurrences. Voices, shadows, things that sound almost supernatural." Her eyebrows rose skeptically. "Supernatural? In this old place?" She shook her head, glancing around at the debris. "You know people's imaginations can run wild, especially in a city like New Orleans." "Maybe," I admitted, though doubt gnawed at me. The sensation of being watched had returned, prickling the back of my neck like invisible eyes boring into me. But what if these aren't just stories? What if they're warnings? We stood there for a moment, tension hanging between us like the humid air before a storm. I could see Rebecca struggling with the idea, her practical mind at odds with the creeping unease that seemed to have settled over the entire site. "Look," she said finally, "we need to focus on the demolition. If there's anything genuinely dangerous here, we can't let it interfere with our work schedule." I nodded reluctantly, knowing she was right. But the journal felt like an anchor, connecting me to something deeper than the physical work ahead of us. As the crew resumed their tasks, I tucked the journal into my backpack, promising myself I would read it thoroughly later. But even as I tried to concentrate on documenting the demolition, my mind kept wandering back to those haunting entries, to the whispers of a past that seemed determined not to be forgotten. Hours passed as the sun continued its journey across the sky, painting the site in increasingly dramatic shades of orange and red. Each sound seemed amplified in the growing twilight: the rumble of machinery, the rustle of Spanish moss in the live oak trees, and the occasional clatter of falling debris. But gradually, I became aware of something more unsettling. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, weaving through my consciousness like smoke. "David, Rebecca's voice interrupted my thoughts once again. "We need your help clearing this section. We're almost done for the day." "Of course," I called back, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. I joined the team, trying to push aside the growing sense of unease. But as I worked, the whispers seemed to grow stronger, more insistent, calling me back to that mysterious door I had noticed earlier. I glanced over at Rebecca, who was deep in conversation with another worker about the next day's schedule. Seizing the opportunity, I quietly slipped away from the group, drawn like a magnet to the ornate entrance that lay partially hidden beneath the rubble. The door felt even colder as I approached it this time, its brass fittings tarnished with age and neglect. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had become more distinct, forming fragmented words that slipped through my mind like shadows. I couldn't make out their meaning, but there was an urgency to them that made my pulse quicken. "Help us." The voice was soft, almost familiar, like a half-remembered dream. I recoiled, fear gripping my heart. "What's happening here?" I whispered to myself. Summoning my courage, I pushed the door open. It creaked ominously, the sound echoing through the gathering darkness. Beyond the threshold lay a small room shrouded in shadows, a stark contrast to the bustling activity outside. The air was thick with dust, and an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on everything. I stepped inside, my pulse hammering in my ears. The space was cramped and filled with the remnants of forgotten furniture. An ornate writing desk covered in decades of grime. A tall bookshelf with most of its contents long since removed. And in the corner, an elegant Victorian chair that seemed to rock slightly, as if disturbed by some unseen presence. The shadows appeared to move along the walls, shifting into shapes that almost looked alive. As I ventured deeper into the room, my heart pounded against my ribs. The whispers grew louder, filling the space around me. "Help us find peace." The voice drifted through the air like a sorrowful plea. I felt a cold draft wash over me, sending chills down my spine despite the Louisiana heat. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Remember," the voice came again, clearer this time, filled with an otherworldly sadness. "Remember what they took from us." Images flashed through my mind, faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never seen, fragments of a history that felt both foreign and familiar. A young woman's laughter echoed in my memory, quickly replaced by sounds of distress. I staggered backward, reality blurring around the edges. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into complete darkness. I gasped, panic surging as I fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. "Rebecca," I shouted, pounding on the door with my fists. "Help me!" My voice echoed in the confined space, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a hurricane of sound. I turned around, trying to orient myself in the pitch-black room. The air felt alive, charged with a presence that lurked just beyond my perception. "What do you want from me?" I called out, desperation creeping into my voice. "Find us," the voice came again, more distinct now, filled with an anguish that seemed to reach into my very soul. "You are our only hope for peace." I swallowed hard, fear tightening its grip on my throat. "Find you? Who are you?" But the room remained silent, except for the weight of darkness pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I closed my eyes, struggling to breathe, and for a terrifying moment, I could feel the cold touch of the past reaching out to embrace me. In that instant of pure terror, I realized I was not alone. The shadows shifted around me, and the whispers formed a chorus of voices, each one pleading for recognition, each one demanding to be heard. "Help us remember who we were," they urged, their words echoing through the walls and reverberating in my bones. I took a shaky breath, steeling myself against the fear. "I will help you," I promised, though my voice trembled. "I will uncover what happened here." With renewed determination, I turned back to the door and pounded against it with all my strength. "Let me out. I can help you." The oppressive darkness seemed to ease slightly, the whispers growing quieter as if considering my words. But just as hope began to flicker within me, the door rattled violently, sending a jolt of terror through my entire body. "David," Rebecca's voice finally broke through, frantic and filled with worry. "Are you in there?" "Yes," I shouted, relief flooding through me. "Get me out of here." The door swung open, flooding the room with blessed light. I stumbled forward, gasping as I stepped back into the familiar chaos of the demolition site. Rebecca stood there, wide-eyed and breathless. "What happened to you?" she asked, searching my face for answers. I'm not sure," I replied, my voice still shaking. "But there's something here, Rebecca. Something from the past that needs to be acknowledged." Her expression hardened. "David, we can't get lost in old ghost stories. We have a job to finish." But as I looked back at the entrance to that mysterious room, I knew I couldn't simply walk away. The past was reaching out to me, and I felt an undeniable obligation to listen. It was my responsibility to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or disturbing it might prove to be. Little did I know that the spirits of the Roosevelt were only beginning to stir, and the secrets buried beneath decades of silence would challenge everything I thought I knew about history, memory, and the power of the human soul to endure beyond death. The sun was beginning to set behind the sprawling live oaks that lined the street, casting an eerie glow across the demolition site. As I stood there, my heart still racing from the encounter in that mysterious room, I could feel the remnants of that otherworldly presence clinging to me like humidity on a summer evening. Rebecca watched me closely, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "David, you need to get yourself together," she said firmly. "We have to finish this demolition before nightfall. If there's anything structurally dangerous in that building, we can't afford to leave it standing." I nodded, trying to regain my composure. "You're absolutely right," I replied, though the urgency in my chest refused to fade. The journal in my backpack seemed to pulse with hidden knowledge, silently demanding my attention. "But Rebecca, can we just take a moment to consider what I discovered? This place has a history that deserves to be understood." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I understand your passion for history, but we can't let superstition interfere with our work. We're here to demolish a building, not investigate ghost stories." But as she spoke, the shadows seemed to deepen around us, and I felt that familiar chill creeping up my spine. The building itself seemed to be listening, waiting for our next move. "Let's just wrap up for today," I suggested, glancing nervously at the Roosevelt's remaining structure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was still hidden within those walls. Rebecca agreed, and we returned to supervise the final cleanup. The machinery roared back to life, and I threw myself into the physical work, though my mind kept drifting back to the journal and the voices I had heard. I could almost feel the pages calling to me, urging me to uncover the secrets they contained. As darkness began to fall over New Orleans, casting long shadows across the site, I felt the atmosphere shift once again. The air grew cooler despite the lingering heat, and those whispers, which had faded during the day, returned with renewed intensity. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but the sensation of being watched intensified, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. "David, come look at this." Rebecca's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see her standing near the foundation of the building, a puzzled expression on her face. "What is it?" I asked, walking over to her. "Look at this section," she said, pointing to part of the foundation that had crumbled during the demolition. Beneath the rubble lay something unexpected, a piece of ornate ironwork, intricately crafted with symbols and designs I didn't immediately recognize. "What do you make of it?" I asked, kneeling down to examine it more closely. "I have no idea," she replied, her brow furrowed. "But it looks like it's been here since the original construction. We should probably report this to the Historical Preservation Society." I traced the metal work with my fingers, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into creating it. As I did, a shiver ran through me, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a gathering storm. "Rebecca, this might be connected to what I found in the journal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "These symbols, they could be significant." "Let's not jump to conclusions," she cautioned, but I could see uncertainty creeping into her eyes. As the crew worked to clear more debris, I pulled out the journal again, flipping through its delicate pages with growing urgency. I needed to find a connection, some clue that would help me understand the meaning behind those symbols, and the voices that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed across the site, causing everyone to freeze. I looked up to see that another section of the hotel had partially collapsed, sending dust and fragments flying through the air. "Everyone get back," Rebecca shouted, urging the crew to retreat. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, but in the chaos, I caught another glimpse of movement, a figure that seemed to glide through the dust, just beyond the reach of our lights. "Did you see that?" I asked, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "See what?" Rebecca replied, looking around frantically. "There was something moving through the debris," I said, though I could hear how crazy it sounded even as the words left my mouth. The whispers intensified once more, filling the air with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "Help us, remember us." "David," Rebecca's voice cut through my growing panic. "We need to evacuate the site. This place isn't safe after dark." Reluctantly, I agreed, though every instinct told me we were missing something crucial. As we gathered our equipment and prepared to leave, the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon, leaving the Roosevelt bathed in the artificial glow of our work lights. As we walked toward our vehicles, I felt that familiar sensation of being watched, stronger than ever before. I glanced back at the hotel one final time, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a face in one of the upper windows, pale and sorrowful, looking down at us with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. "Rebecca, did you?" I began, but when I looked again, the window was empty. "Did I what?" she asked, not bothering to turn around. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I turned back toward the building one last time. The whispers seemed to follow us even as we drove away, an echo of the past that refused to be silenced. That night I lay in my small apartment in the French Quarter, staring at the ceiling while the journal lay open on my nightstand. The elegant handwriting seemed to dance in the lamplight, and I could almost hear the voice of whoever had penned those desperate words. Help us, remember us. Sleep eluded me completely, and as the hours stretched on, I found myself unable to resist the pull of those mysterious pages. I had to return to the Roosevelt. I had to delve deeper into whatever secrets lay buried beneath the rubble and the decades of neglect. Just before dawn, I made my decision. I would go back to the site, armed with the journal and a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how disturbing it might prove to be. The past was calling to me, and I could no longer ignore its desperate plea for recognition. Little did I know that the spirits dwelling within the Roosevelt's walls had secrets far darker and more complex than I could have ever imagined, and that my quest for answers would lead me down a path from which there might be no return. The first light of dawn crept through my apartment windows like fingers of hope, but I had barely slept. My mind raced with fragments of whispered words and shadowy figures that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of my vision. The journal lay beside me, its pages still open to the entry that had haunted me through the long night. I dressed quickly, driven by a mixture of anticipation and dread that I couldn't shake. As I drove through the quiet streets of New Orleans toward the demolition site, I felt a strange electricity in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the energy of unfinished business. When I arrived at the Roosevelt, the morning light revealed the site in a different perspective, less threatening than it had seemed the night before, yet somehow more poignant. The skeletal remains of the once grand hotel stood like a monument to forgotten dreams, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for all the stories that would be lost forever. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath, the familiar scent of old brick and decay filling my lungs. There was no sign of Rebecca or the demolition crew yet. They probably wouldn't arrive for another hour. This was my chance to explore without interruption, to delve deeper into the mysteries that called to me. As I walked toward the building, the whispers returned, softer now but more insistent than before. Help us, remember. The voices seemed to drift on the morning breeze, wrapping around me like an embrace. I made my way to the small room where I had been trapped the day before. The door stood slightly ajar, its hinges creaking gently in the wind. The interior was bathed in the golden light of dawn, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded me before seemed to have lifted, replaced by something more like melancholy. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The Victorian chair in the corner rocked slowly, as if moved by an invisible hand. I approached it carefully, drawn by an inexplicable need to understand what had happened in this place. "What do you want me to know?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. Remember, the voice was clearer now, a gentle whisper that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Remember, Elizabeth. I felt a chill run down my spine. Elizabeth. That name meant something, though I couldn't place it yet. I pulled out the journal and began flipping through its pages more carefully, searching for any mention of that name. And there it was, on a page I had missed before. "My dearest Elizabeth," an entry began, "the nights grow long without you, and I fear the shadows that gather in the corners of this place. They whisper of things that should remain buried, of secrets that died with the old century. My hands trembled as I continued reading. The entries painted a picture of a tragic love story, of two people whose lives had been cut short by circumstances beyond their control. But there was something more, something darker lurking beneath the romantic tragedy. As I read on, the whispers around me grew stronger, and I began to feel as if I were not alone in the room. The air shimmered slightly, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the faint outline of a woman in a 1920s dress, her face turned away from me. "Elizabeth," I called out softly. The figure turned, and I caught a glimpse of eyes filled with such profound sadness that it took my breath away. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she pointed toward a section of the wall where the plaster had crumbled away, revealing the original brick beneath. I approached the wall cautiously, running my hands over the rough surface. My fingers found something unusual, a loose brick that shifted when I touched it. Working carefully, I managed to remove it, revealing a small, hidden space behind. Inside was a collection of items that took my breath away. A bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a small silver locket, and a photograph of a couple standing in front of the Roosevelt in what looked like the 1920s. The woman in the photo bore a striking resemblance to the figure I had just seen. With trembling hands, I opened the first letter. It was addressed to my beloved Elizabeth and dated October 15th, 1923. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been in great distress. "They are coming for us," the letter read. "The men who control this city will not allow our love to flourish. They say we are a threat to their order, that our happiness somehow undermines their power. But I will not let them take you from me, my darling. If we cannot be together in this life, then perhaps." The letter ended abruptly, leaving the sentence unfinished. My heart raced as I realized I was reading about real people, real lives that had been cut tragically short. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was a piece of history that had been deliberately hidden away. "David," a voice called from outside, startling me from my discoveries. It was Rebecca, arriving earlier than expected. "In here," I called back, carefully gathering the letters and artifacts. She appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from concern to amazement as she saw what I had found. "My God, David, what is all this?" "Evidence," I replied, my voice filled with excitement and sorrow. "Evidence of what really happened here. Elizabeth and her lover, they were forced apart by someone. These letters suggest they were in danger." Rebecca knelt beside me, examining the photograph with wonder. "The detail in this picture is incredible. Look at the way the hotel looked back then. It was absolutely magnificent." As we studied the artifacts together, I felt the whispers grow stronger around us, as if the spirits were pleased that their story was finally being uncovered. But there was also an urgency to their voices that I couldn't ignore. "We need to learn more," I said, standing up with determination. "There has to be more evidence somewhere in this building. These people deserve to have their story told." Just as I spoke, the building shuddered slightly, and we heard the distant rumble of the demolition equipment starting up for the day. The irony was not lost on me. We were racing against time to uncover the past, while machines worked to erase it forever. "David, we need to be careful," Rebecca warned, but I could see that she was as invested in the mystery as I was. "If there are more artifacts here, we need to find them before." Her words were cut off by a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the building. We looked at each other with growing alarm. "The crew must have started without us," Rebecca said, but something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. As we gathered the letters and headed toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by hostile spirits, but by souls who were desperately grateful that someone was finally listening to their story. The whispers followed us, softer now, but still insistent. "Remember us, tell our story." I clutched the bundle of letters tightly, knowing that whatever happened next, I would not let Elizabeth and her lover be forgotten again. Their love had been silenced once, but I would make sure their voices were heard, even if it meant confronting the darker truths that lay buried beneath the rubble of the Roosevelt Hotel. Have you ever felt the weight of ancient eyes watching you, even when you're surrounded by nothing but tombstones and silence? That bone-deep certainty crept over me one cursed evening, triggering a chain of events that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about the world. I lived in a modest house on Elm Street, where the windows overlooked the old St. Matthew's Cemetery. The weathered headstones stood like crooked teeth in the moonlight, some dating back to the 1800s. Most nights, the graveyard was peaceful, almost comforting in its eternal stillness. But that particular evening, something had shifted in the air itself. As I trudged home from my graveyard shift at Murphy's gas station, an odd sound drifted through the autumn air. It started as a whisper, barely audible above the rustle of dying leaves. I paused beside the cemetery's wrought iron gate, tilting my head to listen. The sound grew clearer, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to pulse from somewhere deep within the graveyard. I glanced around the empty street, feeling shadows press against me like living things. The street lamps cast weak pools of yellow light, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement between the headstones. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself it was just exhaustion from another long shift. But as I hurried toward my front door, the chanting continued, weaving through the night like a thread of ancient language. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, the metal slipping between my fingers. Inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The familiar sounds of my small house, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the old grandfather clock should have been soothing. But that otherworldly chanting seemed to echo in my bones. "Pull yourself together, Jake," I muttered, forcing my heart to slow its frantic pace. I switched on the living room lamp, pushing back the darkness that seemed to cling to every corner. But even as I settled into my worn armchair, unease gnawed at me like a hungry animal. The hours crawled by, and I tried to lose myself in late-night television. Yet the chanting had left something behind, a frequency that vibrated just beneath my consciousness. Every creak of the old house made me jump, and I found myself glancing toward the window that faced the cemetery, half expecting to see figures moving between the graves. Then it happened. A tremendous crash echoed from the direction of the cemetery, followed by the sound of splintering wood. My blood ran cold as I leaped to my feet, peering through the curtains. The graveyard was bathed in pale moonlight, shadows dancing between the monuments like restless spirits. Through the darkness, I could make out a massive shape, what looked like a fallen tree across several headstones. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. I grabbed my phone and dialed Father William Cross, the elderly priest who attended St. Matthew's Church for over 30 years. He lived in the rectory just beyond the cemetery, and would know if something had happened. "Hello?" His voice was strained, as if he'd been expecting my call. "Father Cross, it's Jake Miller from Elm Street. Did you hear that crash?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "Yes, my son. The old oak by the Morrison crypt finally gave way," he replied, but there was something else in his tone, a carefully controlled fear. "Jake, you should stay indoors tonight. There are disturbances in the cemetery." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of disturbances?" "Things that should remain buried don't always stay that way," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The ground has been restless lately. People have been reporting strange sounds, shadows moving where they shouldn't. You live close to the cemetery, son. Be careful." I swallowed hard, feeling ice form in my stomach. "Father, what aren't you telling me?" "Some knowledge is too dangerous to share freely," he said. "But if you see anything unusual, anything at all, call me immediately. And whatever you do, don't go into the cemetery alone." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone screen. I checked the time, nearly midnight. I couldn't shake the feeling that Father Cross's warning and the fallen tree were connected to something far more sinister than a simple storm. I made myself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma helping to ground me in reality. But as I stood at the kitchen window, steam rising from my mug, the shadows outside seemed to deepen and twist. My eyes were drawn to the cemetery, and this time I was certain I saw a figure standing beside the fallen oak, a tall silhouette that didn't belong among the headstones. I set down my coffee, heart hammering. The figure was gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness between the graves. But I knew I had seen it, a flicker of movement, purposeful and aware. Suddenly, 3 sharp knocks echoed through my house. I froze, nearly dropping my phone. Who would be at my door at this hour? My pulse raced as I approached the front door, dread settling in my chest like a stone. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing except the empty porch. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. Silence answered me, thick, expectant silence. I waited, listening to my own ragged breathing. "Is someone there?" I tried again, but the only response was the distant sound of wind moving through the cemetery trees. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The porch was empty, but something had been left on my doorstep. A small, tarnished cross, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. I picked it up, feeling its unexpected weight in my palm. The metal was ice cold, as if it had been buried in frozen ground. As I closed the door, I couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was beginning, and I was already too deep to turn back. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the ancient cross clutched in my hand. The chanting returned, drifting through my bedroom window like a lullaby from hell. It was real, I was certain now. But what did it mean? And who had left the cross on my doorstep? Morning came reluctantly, gray light filtering through my curtains like smoke. I dragged myself from bed, exhausted and on edge. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each detail more unsettling than the last. I had barely slept, and the world outside seemed unchanged, oblivious to the darkness that had stirred in the cemetery. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood began to filter in, cars starting, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. I forced myself to get ready for another day, but the weight of the cross in my pocket was a constant reminder of the mystery that had found me. Over breakfast, I opened the local newspaper, hoping for some sense of normalcy. Instead, a headline made my blood run cold. Third person missing in 2 weeks, police baffled. My hands trembled as I read the details. 3 residents had vanished without a trace. Their last known locations, all within a few blocks of St. Matthew's Cemetery. The article mentioned strange reports from witnesses, shadows moving independently of any light source, whispers in languages no one recognized, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. I pushed the newspaper away, feeling sick. The cross seemed to burn in my pocket, as if it were trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. After forcing down a piece of toast, I decided to take a walk. Maybe fresh air would help clear my head. I stepped outside, but the weight of the previous night still clung to me like a funeral shroud. The neighborhood bustled with normal activity, yet I felt more isolated than ever. People hurried past, unaware of the darkness that had awakened so close to their homes. I found myself walking toward the cemetery, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The wrought iron gates stood open, as they always did during daylight hours. The fallen oak dominated the landscape, its massive trunk crushing several old headstones. But it was what lay beyond the tree that caught my attention. A partially collapsed crypt, its stone door hanging open like a gaping mouth. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I stepped through the cemetery gates. The air felt different here, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. As I approached the damaged crypt, I noticed something glinting in the debris. My heart pounded as I knelt down, brushing away chunks of broken stone. It was another cross, identical to the one in my pocket but larger, its surface covered in the same mysterious symbols. As I lifted it from the rubble, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around to find a woman standing among the headstones, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, her eyes sharp with intelligence and fear. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Not alone, and certainly not with that. I clutched the cross tighter. "Who are you?" "Emma Reynolds," she replied, stepping closer. "I'm the city historian, and I've been researching the disappearances. That cross you're holding, it's connected to what's happening here." My pulse quickened. Connected how? She glanced around nervously, as if expecting shadows to materialize from behind the headstones. "There's a reason this cemetery has been the site of strange occurrences for over a century. The church was built on cursed ground, and these crosses were created to contain something that should never have been disturbed." "Contain what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Follow me," she said urgently. "But stay close. The sun won't protect us for much longer." She led me deeper into the cemetery, past weathered angels and elaborate mausoleums. The air grew colder with each step, and I could swear I heard whispers emanating from the very ground beneath our feet. We stopped before an ancient section of the graveyard, where the headstones were so old their inscriptions had been worn smooth by time. "This is where it started," Emma said, pointing to a massive stone monument at the center of the old section. 1847. A plague swept through the town, killing dozens. But the deaths weren't from disease, they were from something far worse. I felt the cross in my pocket growing warmer. "What do you mean?" "The original church records speak of a dark presence that emerged during the plague. People didn't just die, they vanished, leaving behind only these crosses. The survivors thought they had contained it, but they were wrong. It's been waiting, growing stronger, and now it's awakening again. As she spoke, I noticed the shadows around us deepening, despite the afternoon sun. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt that same otherworldly chanting beginning to build in the air around us. "We need to get to the church," Emma said, fear creeping into her voice. "Father Cross has been guarding secrets for decades. If anyone knows how to stop this, it's him." But as we turned to leave, I saw them, figures emerging from behind the headstones, their forms shifting and indistinct, as if they were made of shadow and malice. The chanting grew deafening, and the temperature plummeted. "Run," Emma shouted, grabbing my arm. We sprinted through the cemetery, the shadow figures pursuing us with inhuman speed. My lungs burned as we raced toward the church, the crosses in my pockets seeming to pulse with desperate energy. We burst through the church doors just as the shadows reached the threshold. They recoiled, hissing like wounded animals, but I could see they were testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses. "Father Cross," Emma called out, her voice echoing in the empty nave. "We need help." The elderly priest emerged from the sacristy, his face grave. "I've been expecting you both," he said. "The time for secrets has passed. Come, there's something in the basement you need to see." As he led us toward a hidden door behind the altar, I realized we had stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple mystery. The shadows outside pressed against the stained glass windows, and I knew our sanctuary was only temporary. The basement of St. Matthew's Church was a labyrinth of stone corridors and forgotten chambers. Father Cross led us through the maze with the confidence of someone who had walked these paths for decades. The air was thick with the scent of old incense, and something else, something ancient and wrong. "The church has been a guardian for over 100 years, Father Cross explained as we descended deeper into the darkness. But guardians can fail, and seals can weaken. What you've awakened tonight has been waiting for someone to find those crosses." "What are they?" I asked, feeling the weight of the artifacts in my pockets. "Keys," he replied simply. "Keys to a prison that was never meant to be opened." We reached a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with symbols that matched those on the crosses. Father Cross produced an ornate key and unlocked the door, revealing a circular chamber lined with stone tablets. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay an open book bound in cracked leather. "The records of Father Marcus Blackwood," Father Cross said, his voice heavy with reverence and fear. "He was the priest who originally contained the entity during the plague of 1847. But containment was all he could achieve. Destruction was beyond his power." Emma approached the book, her historian's instincts overriding her fear. "What does it say?" "It speaks of a ritual," Father Cross replied. "A way to send the entity back to where it came from. But the cost," he trailed off, his eyes haunted. Before I could ask what he meant, a tremendous crash echoed through the church above us. The sound of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the air, followed by a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. "It's broken through," Father Cross whispered. "The entity is free." The temperature in the chamber dropped dramatically, and our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The chanting I had heard the night before grew louder, no longer distant, but surrounding us, pressing in from all sides. "The ritual," Emma said urgently, flipping through the pages of the ancient book. "Tell us what we need to do." Father Cross looked at us both with eyes full of sorrow. The crosses must be returned to their original resting places, and someone must speak the words of binding. But the entity will fight back. It will try to possess whoever attempts the ritual. Then we'll do it together, I said, surprised by the determination in my own voice. A sound like breaking glass echoed through the chamber, and suddenly the shadows in the corners began to move. They flowed like liquid darkness, reaching toward us with tendrils of pure malevolence. The crosses in my pockets burned like fire, and I realized they were the only things keeping the shadows at bay. "The first cross goes to the Morrison crypt," Father Cross said quickly. "The second to the old section where the original victims were buried. And the third," he paused, his face pale. "The third must be placed at the source, the original grave where the entity first emerged." The shadows surged forward, and I felt something cold and alien brush against my mind. For a moment, I wasn't Jake Miller anymore. I was someone else, someone hungry and ancient, and filled with centuries of rage. The sensation was so overwhelming that I stumbled, nearly dropping the crosses. "Fight it," Emma shouted, grabbing my arm. "Don't let it in." I gritted my teeth and focused on the weight of the crosses, on the warmth of human contact, on anything that anchored me to myself. The alien presence recoiled, but I could feel it circling, waiting for another opportunity. "We have to move now," Father Cross said, "before it grows stronger." As we prepared to leave the chamber, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the depths of the shadows, I could see faces, the missing people, trapped in the entity's darkness, their eyes pleading for release. We're not just sealing it away, I realized. We're freeing them. Father Cross nodded grimly. "If we succeed, if we fail, we'll join them in the darkness." The church above us had been transformed into a nightmare landscape. Shadows writhed across the walls like living things, and the pews had been scattered as if by a tremendous force. The stained glass windows had shattered, letting in the cold night air and the sound of that terrible chanting. "Stay together," Father Cross warned. "The entity will try to separate us." We moved through the ruined church, the crosses blazing with protective light. But I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, more focused. It knew what we were trying to do, and it was gathering its power to stop us. As we reached the cemetery, I saw the true scope of what we were facing. The very ground was alive with shadow, and the headstones seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. In the distance, I could see the fallen oak, and beyond it, the Morrison crypt where our desperate mission would begin. "Remember," Father Cross said, his voice barely audible over the supernatural storm raging around us. "The words must be spoken exactly as written. Any mistake, and the entity will break free completely." I nodded, gripping the first cross tightly. As we stepped into the shadow-infested cemetery, I knew that whatever happened next would determine not just our fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever lived in this cursed place. The battle for St. Matthew's Cemetery was about to begin. The graveyard had become a battlefield between light and darkness. As we approached the Morrison crypt, shadows writhed around us like serpents, testing the protective barrier created by the crosses. The entity's fury was palpable, a suffocating presence that made every breath a struggle. "The first cross goes here," Father Cross said, pointing to a specific stone in the crypt's foundation. "When you place it, you must speak the words exactly as they appear in the book." Emma held the ancient tome steady, her hands trembling but her voice clear as she read the Latin incantation. I knelt beside the designated stone, feeling the shadow tendrils recoil from the cross's radiance. The moment I pressed it into place, a sound like thunder shook the cemetery, and one of the trapped faces in the darkness suddenly blazed with light before disappearing. "One down," I gasped, feeling drained but determined. We fought our way through the cemetery to the old section, where the original plague victims lay buried. Here, the entity's resistance was stronger, more desperate. Shadows coalesced into almost human forms, reaching for us with claws of pure darkness. The second cross burned like a star as I placed it at the base of the weathered monument, and Emma's voice rang out with the binding words. Another face in the darkness was freed, and I felt the entity's rage washing over us like a tidal wave of hatred. "The source," Father Cross said, his voice strained. "We must reach the source." The original grave lay at the heart of the old section, marked by a simple stone that had been worn smooth by time and weather. But as we approached, the entity made its final, desperate attack. The shadows around us solidified, becoming a wall of impenetrable darkness. "I can't see the grave," Emma said, panic creeping into her voice. "Trust the crosses," Father Cross replied. "They'll guide you." I closed my eyes and let the burning warmth of the final cross lead me forward. Step by step, I pushed through the wall of shadow, feeling the entity's presence pressing against my mind, trying to break through my defenses. But I held fast to who I was, to the knowledge that people were counting on me. When I opened my eyes, I was standing before the source, a simple headstone with no name, just a date, 1847. I knelt and placed the final cross against the stone, and Emma's voice rose in the concluding words of the ritual. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Light exploded from the three crosses, connecting them in a triangle of blazing energy. The entity's roar shook the very foundations of the cemetery, and then, suddenly, it was gone. The shadows dissipated like smoke, and the trapped faces appeared one final time, no longer pleading, but grateful, before fading into peaceful rest. The cemetery was quiet again, truly quiet for the first time in over a century. "Is it over?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. Father Cross nodded, exhaustion written across his weathered face. "The entity has been sent back to whatever realm it came from. The crosses will keep it there, as long as they remain in place." As dawn broke over St. Matthew's Cemetery, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The missing people would be found safe, their memories of the ordeal mercifully blank. The neighborhood could rest peacefully again. But I knew I would never forget what I had seen in those shadows, or the faces of those who had been trapped for so long. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, no matter how dangerous the truth might be. Emma and I walked home together as the sun rose, the crosses still glowing faintly in the morning light. The graveyard shift was over, but the memory of what we had accomplished would stay with us forever. Do you ever feel like someone's watching you? The question echoed through my mind as I sat hunched over my psychology textbook in my cramped dorm room. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the worn carpet. Outside, the university campus was alive with the distant sounds of late-night parties and study groups. But inside my single room on the 13th floor, an unsettling silence had settled like a heavy blanket. I had chosen this particular dormitory specifically for its reputation as the quietest on campus. After transferring here from a community college across the state, I craved the solitude needed to focus on my studies. The aged brick building, constructed in 1952, housed mostly graduate students and serious undergraduates who valued their academic pursuits above social gatherings. As I reached for my coffee mug, the ceramic handle felt unusually cold against my palm. Steam rose from the dark liquid, curling upward in spirals that reminded me of ghostly fingers reaching toward the ceiling. I took a sip, letting the bitter warmth ground me in reality, but the sensation of being observed refused to fade. The digital clock on my desk read 11:47 p.m. in bright red numbers. Most of my floor mates had either gone to bed or were pulling all-nighters in the library. I should have been there too, surrounded by other stressed students and the comforting hum of air conditioning. But something had drawn me back to my room earlier than usual. A faint scratching sound emanated from somewhere within the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the building's ancient heating system, or perhaps mice in the walls. Old dormitories were notorious for their unwelcome rodent residents, but as I listened more carefully, the sound seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic to be natural. I closed my textbook and stood up, my chair creaking in protest. The sound grew more distinct now, coming from the direction of the hallway. It reminded me of fingernails dragging across wood, slow and methodical, as if someone were trying to communicate through Morse code. My heart began to race as I approached the door. The peephole offered a fisheye view of the corridor, distorting everything into a curved nightmare of shadows and fluorescent lighting. The hallway appeared empty, stretching in both directions like a tunnel lined with identical doors, each marked with small white numbers. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by something far more unsettling. The soft sound of footsteps, barely audible through the thick door. They moved with purpose, neither hurried nor casual, but with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I pressed my ear against the cool metal of the door, straining to hear more. The footsteps paused directly outside my room. My breath caught in my throat as I imagined someone standing just inches away, separated only by the thin barrier of the door. Minutes passed in absolute silence. My legs began to ache from standing so still, but I dared not move. Finally, the footsteps resumed, fading as they moved toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. Unable to contain my curiosity any longer, I slowly turned the deadbolt and cracked open the door. The hallway stretched before me, bathed in the harsh glare of overhead lights that buzzed with electrical energy. The industrial carpeting showed years of wear, with darker paths marking the routes most traveled by countless students. That's when I noticed it. A door at the far end of the corridor stood slightly ajar. Room 1328, according to the number plate. I had walked past that room hundreds of times during my 3 months in the dormitory, and it had always been securely closed. In fact, I had never seen anyone enter or leave it. The rational part of my mind suggested that maintenance workers might have been conducting repairs. But something deeper, more primal, whispered warnings about investigating further. Nevertheless, my feet carried me forward, drawn by a combination of academic curiosity and the kind of morbid fascination that compels people to slow down at accident scenes. As I approached the partially open door, A smell reached my nostrils that made my stomach clench. It was the scent of dampness mixed with something metallic and organic, like copper pennies left in stagnant water. The odor grew stronger with each step, until it felt like a living thing crawling up my throat. "Hello," I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone in there?" The response came immediately, but not in the form I expected. Instead of a voice, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand at attention. A soft, desperate whimpering, like an animal caught in a trap. I pushed the door open wider and stepped into the room. The layout was identical to my own, but the similarities ended there. Where my room was cluttered with textbooks and personal belongings, this space felt hollow and abandoned. Dust particles danced in the air, illuminated by the pale light filtering through grimy windows. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an overturned desk, I saw movement. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and the shape resolved into a human figure. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. "Are you okay?" I asked, taking a cautious step closer. She looked up at me with eyes that held a wild, desperate quality, like a deer caught in headlights. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hoarse and strained. "It knows you're here now." "What knows I'm here? Who are you?" I knelt down, trying to appear non-threatening. She wore what looked like a university sweatshirt, though it was torn and stained with substances I preferred not to identify. "My name is Emily," she whispered, glancing nervously at the door behind me. "I'm a graduate student in the psychology department, or I was before this started." "Before what started?" She grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into my skin. "The experiments," she said. "Dr. Morrison's research project. He said it was about sleep deprivation and its effects on perception, but it was something else entirely, something wrong." I had heard of Dr. Morrison, though I had never taken any of his classes. He was known around campus as a brilliant but eccentric professor who conducted research that pushed the boundaries of conventional psychology. "What kind of experiments?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "Sensory manipulation, isolation chambers, chemical compounds that alter brain chemistry." Her words tumbled out in a rush, as if she were afraid of running out of time. At first, it seemed legitimate. The university approved it, and the pay was good. But then the side effects started. "What side effects?" "The whispers," she said, her voice dropping to barely audible. "They start as simple auditory hallucinations, but they get stronger, more real, and then you begin to see things that shouldn't exist." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the room that made my blood freeze. It was the same whispering I had been hearing, but now it was clearer, more distinct. Multiple voices seemed to overlap, creating a chorus of urgent, unintelligible pleas. "Help us," the voices seemed to say. "Help us escape." Emily's grip on my arm tightened. "It's starting again," she said. "You need to leave now." But before I could respond, the lights in the room began to flicker violently, casting everything into a strobe-like nightmare of light and shadow. In the intermittent illumination, I caught glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, shapes that shouldn't have been there. "Too late," Emily whispered. "It's found us." The door behind me slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and the room plunged into complete darkness. In the blackness, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they felt like they were coming from inside my own head. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to pierce the darkness. The pale lead beam revealed that Emily had vanished, leaving only disturbed dust patterns where she had been crouching. "Emily," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Where did you go?" The whispers responded, but they weren't coming from Emily. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a cacophony of voices that spoke in languages I couldn't understand, yet somehow comprehended on a level deeper than conscious thought. I stumbled toward where I remembered the door being, but my hands found only smooth wall. Panic began to claw at my chest as I realized that the room's layout had somehow changed. The furniture that had been scattered around the floor was gone, and the space felt larger, more cavernous than any dorm room should be. My phone's battery indicator showed only 12% remaining. In a few hours, I would be trapped in complete darkness with whatever was sharing this space with me. That's when I heard footsteps again, but these were different from the ones in the hallway. They echoed as if they were coming from a great distance, growing closer with each passing second. Heavy boots on what sounded like concrete, not the soft carpet of a dormitory. I pointed my phone's light toward the sound and gasped. Where the far wall should have been, a long corridor stretched into darkness, its walls made of rough stone that glistened with moisture. The air that flowed from this passage carried the scent of deep earth and something far more unsettling. The footsteps were definitely coming from that direction, accompanied now by a new sound, the dragging of something heavy across the ground. Whatever was approaching, it was bringing something with it. "Help me," Emily's voice drifted from the darkness, but it sounded distant and distorted, as if it were coming through water. Against every instinct in my body, I began moving toward the corridor. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that dorm rooms didn't connect to underground tunnels, that the laws of physics were being violated. But my feet carried me forward anyway, drawn by a combination of concern for Emily and a curiosity that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. The corridor was longer than it had first appeared, stretching far beyond the reach of my phone's light. The walls were carved from what looked like limestone, with symbols etched into the surface that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. As I walked deeper into the passage, the whispers grew clearer. I began to distinguish individual voices, each telling a different story of fear and desperation. Some spoke of experiments gone wrong, others of students who had vanished without explanation. All of them pleaded for help, for escape, for an end to whatever had been done to them. The footsteps ahead of me stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. I held my breath, listening for any indication of what waited in the darkness ahead. "Alex," my name echoed through the corridor, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. It was too deep, too resonant, as if it were being projected through some kind of amplification device. "How do you know my name?" I called out, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "We know all their names," the voice replied. "Every student who enters our domain becomes part of the collection." The beam of my phone's light began to flicker, the battery finally giving in to the strain. In the wavering illumination, I caught a glimpse of something that made me question my sanity. Standing at the end of the corridor was a figure in a long, dark coat, but its face was a void of swirling shadows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Run," Emily's voice whispered in my ear, though I couldn't see her anywhere. "Run while you still can." My phone's light died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. But instead of paralyzing me, the blackness seemed to awaken something primal and desperate within me. I turned and began running back the way I had come, my hands trailing along the wall to guide me. Behind me, the footsteps resumed, but now they were accompanied by something that sounded like laughter, if laughter could be made of breaking glass and dying screams. I ran blindly through the darkness, no longer caring about the impossibility of the situation. My only goal was to reach the dorm room, to find some way back to the normal world, where physics made sense and corridors didn't appear out of nowhere. The wall under my hands suddenly changed texture, becoming smooth and familiar. I felt frantically for a door handle and found one, turning it with desperate urgency. Light flooded my vision as I stumbled back into what looked like my dormitory hallway. But something was wrong. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a pattern that hurt my eyes, and the familiar carpet had been replaced with the same stone flooring I had just escaped. The numbered doors that lined the walls were now made of heavy wood bound with iron, like something from a medieval dungeon. "This isn't right," I muttered, looking around for any sign of the normal world I had left behind. The laughter from the corridor grew louder, echoing through this twisted version of my dormitory. I began running toward the stairwell, hoping to find an exit that would lead back to reality. As I ran, doors began opening on either side of the hallway. From each one emerged students I recognized from around campus, but their faces were pale, and their eyes held the same wild desperation I had seen in Emily's. They reached out to me as I passed, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. I reached the stairwell and threw open the door, expecting to find the familiar concrete steps that led to the ground floor. Instead, I found myself looking at a spiral staircase that descended far deeper than any building should go, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. The whispers from below rose like a tide, carrying voices of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people. Students who had vanished over the years, participants in experiments that had gone too far, victims of research that had crossed lines that should never be crossed. "Join us," they called. "Become part of the study." I slammed the door and turned back toward the hallway. But now the corridor stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with doors that bore the names of missing students carved into their surfaces. My own name appeared on a door directly across from where I stood, the letters glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. The footsteps from the corridor had reached the hallway now, and I could hear them approaching from both directions, as if multiple figures were converging on my position. The whispers grew so loud they felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. In desperation, I tried one of the doors at random, hoping to find a room that might offer some refuge or explanation. The handle turned easily, and I stepped inside. The room beyond was not another dorm room, but a laboratory filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Banks of monitors displayed brain wave patterns, and tanks filled with unknown liquids lined the walls. In the center of the room sat a chair surrounded by electrodes and injection devices. "Welcome to the real experiment," a familiar voice said behind me. I turned to see Dr. Morrison standing in the doorway, but like the figure in the corridor, his face was wrong. His features seemed to shift and blur, as if he were being viewed through water, and his eyes held an intelligence that felt alien and cold. The university believes we're studying sleep deprivation, he continued, his voice echoing strangely in the sterile room. But we're exploring something far more interesting, the boundaries between reality and perception, the malleable nature of human consciousness. You're experimenting on students, I said, backing away from him. We're expanding the limits of human experience, he replied. Each subject provides valuable data about how far the mind can be pushed before it breaks completely. The monitors around the room began displaying images that made my stomach lurch. Students strapped to chairs, their eyes wide with terror as unknown substances were injected into their veins. Brain scans showing neural patterns that looked more like chaos than organized thought. Emily was one of our most successful subjects, Dr. Morrison said, moving closer. Her mind adapted to the treatments in fascinating ways. She began experiencing reality on multiple levels simultaneously. Where is she now? Everywhere and nowhere, he replied with what might have been a smile. The treatment freed her from the constraints of linear existence. She exists in all possible states at once, experiencing every potential outcome of every decision. The whispers in the room grew louder, and I realized that many of the voices belonged to students I had known, people who had simply disappeared one day without explanation. They had all ended up here, in this place that existed between reality and nightmare. Your turn, Dr. Morrison said, gesturing toward the chair in the center of the room. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but the door had vanished, replaced by seamless wall. The laboratory felt like it was closing in around me, the ceiling lowering and the walls moving closer together. The process is quite fascinating, Dr. Morrison continued, apparently oblivious to my growing panic. We start with sensory deprivation, then introduce carefully calibrated hallucinogens and electromagnetic stimulation. The subjects begin to perceive reality as we truly believe it exists. Fluid, malleable, infinite. You're insane, I said, though the words felt inadequate to describe the horror of what I was witnessing. Sanity is simply a limitation we place on ourselves, he replied. Our work here removes those limitations. The whispers around me began to organize themselves into coherent words, and I realized they were instructions, telling me how to escape this place. The voices of the disappeared students were trying to help me, sharing the knowledge they had gained from their own experiences in this twisted reality. The door isn't gone, Emily's voice whispered in my ear. It's just hiding. Reality here responds to belief more than physics. I closed my eyes and concentrated on the memory of the door, visualizing it exactly as it had been when I first entered. When I opened my eyes, it was there again, slightly translucent, but definitely present. Dr. Morrison noticed my discovery and moved to block my path, but his form flickered like a bad television signal. You can't leave, he said. You're part of the study now. I refuse to be part of your experiment, I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. The declaration seemed to have physical weight in this place. The laboratory around me began to shake, equipment falling from tables and monitors flickering with static. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and I heard Emily's voice above all the others. Run, she screamed. The belief is breaking down. I lunged for the door, passing through Dr. Morrison's flickering form like he was made of smoke. The handle felt solid under my hand, and I yanked it open to reveal not the twisted hallway, but the familiar corridor of my actual dormitory. I stumbled through and slammed the door behind me, turning to see if it would hold. Where the laboratory had been, I now saw only the door to room 1328, sealed and covered with official university notices declaring it off-limits due to structural damage. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to check the time. The screen showed 3:37 a.m., though it felt like I had been gone for hours. The battery indicator read 98%, as if the entire experience had lasted only minutes. I walked slowly back to my own room, my legs unsteady and my mind reeling from what I had experienced. The hallway looked exactly as it always had, with no sign of the nightmare I had just escaped. Back in my room, I sat on my bed and tried to process what had happened. Had it been a dream? A hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep? The rational explanations felt comforting, but they couldn't account for the lingering smell of damp stone on my clothes, or the way my phone's flashlight app showed recent usage despite having no memory of turning it on. I opened my laptop and began searching for information about Dr. Morrison and his research. What I found made my blood run cold. According to university records, Dr. Morrison had died in a laboratory accident 3 years ago, along with several graduate students who had been participating in his research. The official report mentioned experiments involving sensory deprivation and consciousness alteration, but the details were heavily redacted. The only thing clearly stated was that the research had been discontinued and all related facilities sealed. As I read, I became aware of a sound that made my heart skip a beat. Whispers, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls around me. They were different from before, less desperate and more grateful. "Thank you," Emily's voice said, barely audible but definitely present. "You helped us remember who we were." I never saw Emily again, but over the following weeks, I heard similar whispers from other students who had encountered the laboratory. Each reported being drawn to room 1328. Each experienced something that challenged their understanding of reality. And each came away with the knowledge that some experiments should never be conducted. The university officially denied any knowledge of the incidents, but I noticed that security around the psychology building was increased, and certain areas of the basement were permanently sealed. Dr. Morrison's name was quietly removed from all official publications, and his research was transferred to a classified archive. I continued my studies, but I never again felt completely safe in the dormitory. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear the scratching in the walls or catch glimpses of figures in the hallway that vanished when I looked directly at them. The whispers continued too, but they were different, now less frantic, more peaceful, as if the trapped students had finally found some measure of rest. The experience changed my understanding of reality in ways that no psychology textbook ever could. I learned that consciousness is far more fragile and malleable than we like to believe, and that some knowledge comes at a price too high to pay. Room 1328 remained sealed, but sometimes I would see new students standing outside it, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had led me there. I would watch from a distance, wondering if they would be strong enough to resist the call, or if they would become the next subjects in an experiment that refused to end. The night had taught me that some doors should never be opened, some questions should never be asked, and some whispers should never be answered. But it had also shown me that even in the darkest places, the human spirit finds ways to reach out, to help, to resist being completely consumed by the darkness. The whispers in the walls continue, and sometimes I wonder if I'm truly free from Dr. Morrison's influence, or if I'm simply experiencing a different layer of his experiment. But as long as I can still hear Emily and the others calling out warnings to new potential victims, I know that some part of humanity survived even the most invasive attempts to reshape consciousness itself. The darkness watches, and the whispers never truly stop, but neither does the resistance of those who refuse to be broken by forces beyond their understanding. In that resistance, I find a kind of hope that no experiment can ever fully extinguish. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.